All right, good morning, everyone. We are back for Ezekiel 17. We are in lesson 6a. We did divide this chapter up again, or this particular lesson up again, because it's nicer if you can go through it a little bit slower. So we only had to tackle one chapter this week, and that was Ezekiel 17. So that's where we're at, and we are also on our last week before the holiday break. So we will not be gathering until January 8th. At that time, we will come back. Lesson 1 will be a review week. So for those of you, when you come back, you don't have to have that lesson 6b accomplished yet, but it wouldn't hurt to get started, right? But in particular, I just really encourage that for those of you who are not as familiar with a lot of the scriptures that we've been going through here, maybe this is your first introduction to some of the historical records of Israel and her journey with God. I would recommend that you go back and read Jeremiah, just read it through from beginning to end as a devotional maybe time, just to become familiar with it. And I think you will be very happy because it's going to be familiar. Ezekiel and Daniel and Jeremiah, all three wrote as contemporaries. They were all at the same time in history going through the same historical events. Daniel had been taken in the first siege, Ezekiel in the second siege, Jeremiah will come in the third siege. Each of them are in their own locations. Daniel up at the king's palace with Nebuchadnezzar, Ezekiel by the river Chebar with the masses of the people, and then Jeremiah back in Jerusalem still working with the nobles and with the few that are left behind there in Jerusalem. He will witness and be a part of that time when God's temple is vacated from his spirit that we've already looked at back in chapter 10. So that kind of gives you a little bit of work to do through the holidays. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, you said Jeremiah was left back in Jerusalem with the nobles. I thought the nobles left.
Well, some of the nobles left, but then there are supplementals. Who's the noble that's left in Jerusalem right now? Yes, so he's a noble, and that's what I'm saying. Not all the poor people. No, there's going to be, because remember, we'll get there in this lesson today, but that's what Babylon did was he came in, he took Jehoiakim, who was the king, took him into exile, but he put in his own king, right, a vassal king. And he did that because he needs to keep order. You bring up a good point. Now, I hope I haven't forgotten to say anything else about that introduction, but our concept of war as Americans is very, very different than the concept of war back in those days. They did not conquer kingdoms in those days to annihilate them, to wipe them off the face of the earth. What they would do is they would procure land masses. They would allow those lands with kings who would submit under their authority to stay in place and to work in. This is why you've got Ezekiel and his people over by the land, over by the river Chebar. It's just they've got their own community. They're over there just living life. They have been transplanted, and that's what this parable that we're going to look at here about the vine being transplanted is about. They've been moved and put there to thrive. And the purpose of them being there with this, good morning, see you later. But the purpose of them being here is that God had given them a place to thrive. And their captivity was decreed by God. And it had to do with all their sin, which is our backdrop, which we've done all this research on. So there is still a noble in place. It's one that Nebuchadnezzar put in place. But he is a Jew. He has been put in place to be the king there. It's going to be a temporal thing. We know that. It's not going to end well. But they don't come in to wipe out. And the intention, we're going to see, was that Jerusalem would remain. But it didn't get to remain because of their continued rebellion. Okay? They are. It's not really that bad. No, and as a matter of fact, remember when Daniel was taken into captivity, he was selected from among the nobles as some of the brightest and the best, and then trained in their language, and eventually, what did he become? Number 2 in the land, right? Joseph had the same thing happen when he went down to Egypt. He went in there as a beggar, so to speak, because they were having a plague on the land, and there was, or not a plague, a drought on the land, and there was no food, so they went down to Egypt, and in the end, he wasn't looked at as a foreigner who was invading. They looked at him as a resource. You know, when you think about immigration in America, it's the same thing. We bring in, or at least we used to, bring in the brightest and the best, and we looked at them as resources. They were someone who could come into our country and contribute. They could be our doctors, our lawyers, our scientists, our mathematicians. They would come in and have products to sell. They would bring something of value and richness to our country. That was the point to it. It wasn't, they weren't coming to us to go onto our welfare system. That was never supposed to be the idea. And under kingdoms in the ancient writings here, anywhere you go into the Old Testament, you see that often. The ones they take captive end up being in prominent positions, you know, of authority. And as a matter of fact, we're going to see, if we get to go to the cross references, what happens to Jehoiachin, who's in that captivity, in that second captivity wave with Ezekiel. He went into that captivity. We're going to see what happens to him at the end. He's going to also become exalted eventually. So it's really, or at least there's going to be a redemption to a measure. And so it's really exciting, I think, when you can get your mind wrapped around the different views about, we don't go into a war to shoot and kill and leave their bodies dead on the ground and walk away. They go in to procure land masses and people resources and the resources of the land for their own nation.
I guess I had the other mindset because God tells us to go in sometimes and just...
And wipe it out. Right, and that was a whole different reason, too. Remember, context rules, again, for interpretation. The purpose for that was these were people that were into idolatry. God wanted that off the land. He didn't want his people to be influenced by it. And he had already spent 430 years and longer before that even, working with those people to draw them into faith with him. But they had refused. So at that point, they had been rejected so long, they had to be removed. There's a lot of entanglement, kind of, when you go back to get the history and to kind of piece it all together. But I do think some of those fundamentals, like understanding how war and procuring nations for like world kingdoms like Babylon, and the Medo-Persians did the same thing. You know, when they went in and they took over, they didn't kill everybody, they took them in. And in fact, what happens when the Medes and the Persians come in? They tell the Jews that they can go back and rebuild Jerusalem. And they give them stuff to do it with. And they send them back with all the treasures that they had stolen from them, right? Because that's just the way those kinds of, that's the governing of that time. That's how it was worked. And it's the way it should be today, actually. You know, we don't go in to annihilate. We go in to solve a problem if there's a problem. Right? And in this case, it was God put it on Nebuchadnezzar's heart because his people needed to be judged.
So I guess the question, there, up to 17, we have heard Ezekiel prophesy how bad it's going to be in the third siege, right? Mm-hmm. And they didn't think it was going to be that bad because they were doing, in the second siege living. Mm-hmm. But there were fortresses and they were dying of starvation.
Well, within the city walls of Jerusalem, yeah.
Right, so it was bad.
Inside that city wall, it got bad. And why did it get bad? Why did it get that bad that they started putting up ramparts around them and basically freezing them out from resources so they couldn't get food and they couldn't get water and they couldn't get what? Why did that happen?
Why did the Babylonians come in and do
Yeah,
that?
why?
Because the covenant was broken.
Thank you.
Because there was a covenant,
Yeah.
and he's like, haha, I made a covenant,
That's what
I'm
we
going to go to
studied
Egypt and
today.
get some
Right.
extra
That's
sack.
exactly what happened. So this is where Ezekiel 17 gives us.
And that was after Babylon had already beaten up Egypt first.
It sounds like there's yes, there's
They'd
some.
already done Egypt.
Well, and it was kind of, some of it was simultaneously happening too. I don't have all those details straight in my head, so I don't want to go too far out on a limb here, but
And Jerusalem, because they had schemed together.
right,
Yeah, okay.
right.
Broke the
Okay, so now we're good.
Yeah.
Ready to go? Okay, let's get started on this. So Ezekiel 17. So I think we did pretty good. Actually, that was a pretty good review and also some good context setting there for everybody. And for those of you who have questions, if there are any of you out there online that you're watching and you have questions, just send the texts in to Kristen through our, what is it, Facebook? There's a link to it, or how do they get questions to you?
People that are watching on YouTube,
What-
they just put a comment.
They just put a
People that are
comment.
Here on the Zoom, they just text.
Yeah, okay. They can text or you can put a comment in the link, and then Kristen will forward that on to me, and we'll see if we can get answers for you. But I guess the principle here is, remember, precept is rightly named precept upon precept. You cannot begin to understand the whole picture all at once in your first sitting. It really does take most people a few years to start getting their feet grounded. Some people pick up quicker than others, but it took me a long time. And I don't think I'm necessarily stupid, but I do think that some people just learn quicker. You know, they just have an aptitude for it. I've always wondered why God made me a teacher, because I am not a scholar. You know, I'm not a book-learned person. And for me, and it's probably also why precept works so well for me, because of all the list making, all the drawing of pictures. You know, you draw the pictures together, you pull in all the resources and get it all together, and you start to order it, right? Put it in order, then it starts to make sense to me. And I'm not a person that likes a person to just say, just because it is, you know, that's because I said so. You know, I hate that. I want to know, why do you know what you know? And so for me, this has been such a gift from God, really. And I thank Precept Ministries for all that they've done. Okay, let's get started with Ezekiel. First, let's start right off the bat with some key words and just kind of quickly cover some of the things that you see going on here. The very first thing I want to bring up is this is a riddle again and a parable that starts out, right? So those two words should have been marked there in verse 2. I marked them identically, riddle and parable, in the same way. Did anybody do word studies on those?
Sit on riddle,
Okay, and?
24:20.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a difficult question, a parable, enigmatic saying or question, perplexing saying or question.
Okay, all right. And when you do a parable, the word parable, it can also be a riddle, which is interesting. So in other words, what does that tell you about those two words? They're synonyms. Right. Basically, they're synonyms. They're slightly different, but similar.
And the difference is, I thought, because I was trying to see the difference, the riddle requires an explanation.
Yes.
It's kind of asking a question and
And then giving you an answer to explain it. Okay, so, light bulb came on. Kristen went, oh my gosh. So does that explain why you start the very first few verses with the parable? That's nothing but imagery. And then what happens when you get to the second half of it? He gives you the interpretation of it. He goes, this is what I've just said to you. So there's your riddle and there's your interpretation. That's cool.
maybe it was like an allegory.
Sometimes they can be allegories and allegory. See, this is where, when you go into your how-to study book and look at all the different literary forms that can be used, you know.
Riddle.
Yeah, well, no, but it has parable, it has allegories, anything that gives you a picture of something. Anytime you see the word like, it can even be just in a narrative, like when Jesus would teach, it's like bread, it's like a candle, it's like a sheep, it's like, those are, again, a type of, not riddle, but parable or imagery. And all of them are similar enough. Honestly, I don't think we need to know the exact definitions to the point of, we're not trying to get a literary degree from college in English, right? We're just wanting to understand, what are we looking at here literarily? Why is that important for an inductive student to know that? What happens when you're looking at something that's imagery versus something that's
Imagery, symbols and things, and it's not actually a giant eagle with wings flying around pulling off a tree.
Right.
Like
Right.
It
It
symbolizes something else.
symbolizes something else. And so if you know that, then in the imagery, would you say that on the whole, every piece of the imagery will have an exact fit in reality? No. No. So that's important to help you, because then you don't get wrapped around, but what does that one thing right there mean, right? And if you're not sure and it's not obvious, it may be obscured enough, it doesn't matter. Or maybe later, 10 years down the road, you'll be studying something else. You go, I remember that. Where was that in Ezekiel? And you'll rip and tear until you find it. And you go, there it is. That's what that meant. And it'll all come together, ding, ding, ding. I love that God does that. And I also know this. God does not put one single word in here that does not matter. They all have something that's really profound behind the depth of it. It really is truly like hunting for treasure, and you just keep digging and digging, and there's more and more to be found. So on the one hand, I say lighten up, understand the imagery of it. That's what you're looking at. Try to find the pieces that make sense to you and you can fit something to, an answer to. Dig as hard as you can for research. You can read commentaries. You can go, like I just said, go to Jeremiah and read a companion book. Go back into Daniel and read that one again. You're going to see a lot of imagery there, right? Daniel was an excellent parallel for pictures when it came to this first subject also about the cedar, right? The tree, right? Do you remember the tree vision in Daniel? Yeah, it was a great tree, and he said, cut the stump off, and later he comes back. God will regrow it, basically, reestablish it. So what was the tree? Who was the tree? Do you remember that part? Nebuchadnezzar. And who was he? King of Babylon. So again, a tree represented in that case a what? A nation and a king. So there's imagery in that was already, that's over in Daniel, going on at the same time as all this. I mean, Daniel happened just before this. So, there are tons of other scriptures throughout all of the Old Testament. You can go through the Proverbs, you can go, a lot of places. Isaiah does it, where they talk about things like vines and trees, and all these things symbolize different things. Okay? All right, so keywords, riddle, parable. And what other keywords? Eagle. The eagle, and there's a couple of eagles. They're different. The vine. Okay, so when you titled Ezekiel 17, what did you title it? Oh. Well, if you're only going to title it from verses 1 to 10, what would you title it? There you go. 2 eagles and a vine. 2 eagles and a vine. Let's do that just to start us with. 2 eagles and a vine.
I didn't know if I should put 2 or 3 eagles because it doesn't have 21 through 24 as an eagle, but it's almost like a comparison of a third eagle.
Oh, but no, you shouldn't. And the reason is, it wasn't in the first parable. It's a separate parable. And it says, and in the writing of it in 22, he says, "Thus says the Lord, and I will also do this." So what does that tell you now? It's a different time in history. He's going to do another thing besides what he's talking about over here. He's going to do this, but he's also going to do this other thing at the end. Okay? So good question.
I was sad I didn't catch it until Michael told me, and I was like, oh, I'm stupid.
Oh, no, you're not.
Prophecy
No.
was like, because he was he didn't get any of this, but he's like, I got the last part.
Well, you know, and this is where iron sharpens iron, and you guys have got a blessing. You've got 3 adults in the same house, all doing the same Bible study. What I wouldn't give for that scenario.
Weekly to get the answers ahead of time.
Yeah, that's true. Kaylee shows up when she comes to the house.
She's here twice.
I know, and then she does it here.
Better have it
Yeah, she's getting so smart. She's gonna, she's got it made. Okay, so riddle, eagle, vine, and we've titled at least our initial title. Now, I would recommend a secondary title. This one should go into the interpretation, and that one can go underneath this. But if you're looking at this, it just says that this is parable of, right? 2 eagles and a vine. So that's your first initial blush with it, but then you're going to historically, because of what we are trying to accomplish in here, you're going to historically want to know, what does that mean, two eagles and a vine? So then you're going to want to have a title given to it after that. So with that in mind, let's talk about some of the more less imagery but more specifics. What's going on in the rest of this? Well, he gives us some people, places, and events, right? So give us the people, places, and events subjects here. We got Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. It only says king of Babylon, but we know it's Nebuchadnezzar, okay? And we've got Egypt, and it calls him what here in verse 17? Pharaoh. So just references Pharaoh, so we don't have a name with it, okay? And where is the location that all these things are being talked about, the kingdom that is of the royal line? It's Jerusalem. So we know we're talking about Babylon, Egypt, and Jerusalem. So those give us our geographical places, so we've got a grip on that, okay? When you look at verses 11 to 21, what is your most dominant key word? Covenant. Oh, wow, covenant, the oath, the pledge, okay, so, and by the way, when he goes on to speak about that, how does he refer to that covenant? How does God refer to it? When he says, my covenant, God makes it real personal, right? So it's like, yes, you made that covenant, but it's my covenant. So we have to kind of parse that out a little bit here in a bit. So with that in mind then, now you know that whatever you title this secondary part that's going to give you the instructions concerning it. What is that? The parable of the two eagles and the vine? It has something to do with the covenant. So covenant has to be in that title somewhere. Okay? Beyond that, we'll work through the rest of it as we go through the work, and then we'll title at the end. Okay? All right. So then we have a king. Then we talked about that a moment ago. You said king of Babylon, which we know is Nebuchadnezzar. I just put on my keyword list, not Nebuchadnezzar, but king. Because we know there's actually a variety of kings being mentioned here, right? Pharaoh is a king. And also he said Jerusalem took his king and princes and brought them into Babylon. And then he says he took one of the royal family, and what does he do to him? Makes him a king, right? So there's kings quite a bit in there, all right? So we know this has to do with the hierarchy, the structuring of rulership that's going on in this nation of Israel, okay? What else? There's some other anything else? Oh yes, thus saith the Lord. And then there's that lovely, and you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken. That I love. It's so ominous, isn't it? I love that. And I am the Lord, I have spoken, and I will perform it. I love that. I love my God. He is so awesome. Okay, talk about confidence. Somebody asked a question about that yesterday in Sunday school class, and I said, I just love knowing that my God is sovereign. That is probably, usually people say, oh, it's the love that they love the most. Obviously, I love the grace, and I love the love, obviously. But when you think on the bigger picture of God and his different characteristics, his sovereignty gives me such peace, because I feel so secure knowing he does love me and he has saved me, but that he's sovereign now while he's in that work in my life. That's just an amazing thing, and I see that. And in the whole world, yeah. When you watch the news, you definitely need to know your God is sovereign over this. Okay? Any other thoughts? How about that very last paragraph, 22 to 24? I have a couple more things that come in. Yes, the I will. Mm-hmm. Trees and the cedar and the sprig, right? And the, what was the other one? This a tender twig, yes. Right, a tender twig. Mm-hmm. Twig. Say that one fast, right? A twig. Okay. All right, so that gets us started with some of the words, the key things that pop out at us, and that would help you to begin to say, okay, these are the subject matters that are going on in chapter 17. So now let's go back in and start diving in to say, what do we see going on? So in verses, I broke it down 1 through 6 and then 7 to 10. Did Kay do it that way too? Oh, good. All right. She and I are on the same page. Good. It's an obvious one, right? Okay, so 1 to 6, What do you see as the major event? People, places, and things, which is what history is always about. What's going on there?
The great eagle.
It's a great eagle. And concerning this great eagle, what? What does he do?
Top of the cedar and taking some seed.
Yep, he takes the top of that cedar and he removes it, he takes it and he plants it, right? He plants it somewhere else, a new location. And what happened to that little plant? It became a what? A low growing vine. So somehow, it's a very long title, but I'm going to use the whole thing. A great eagle he took away the top of the cedar he planted it and it became a low-growing vine. Now, we've had some experience with the subject of vines already in this record. That's a very long title, I realize that, but I don't know how to cut it down any smaller. Does anybody else have any suggestions on how to make sure that you...
Because mine just said a great eagle, and the second one was like another great eagle.
Well...
I just left those as my title.
Oh, well, that would be okay, except that it doesn't really tell you what's going on in the paragraph. But yes, if you really want to simplify it, yeah. I just put a great eagle. He took away the top of a cedar. He planted it, and it became a low-growing vine, because that's the event that took place on the whole. Now, it goes on to give a lot more details about that, though, right? What is it? There are some contrasts, and I wanted to point this out to you, because sometimes looking for contrast, again, will show you a bigger picture of what the author is trying to really point to us to. So what are some contrasts going there in that very first section? What contrasts with the top of the cedar? It was a cedar that he clips off the top of that cedar, right? And then what is it contrasted with? Yeah. Top of cedar versus it became a low vine. Now, what might that be talking about there? Imagery-wise, because this is imagery, right? Demotion. I love that. That was really concise. Good, very concise. I love that, girl. Conciseness is my thing. I love that. So at the top of the cedar, it became a low vine. It basically, what we're seeing here is a demotion of something that's going on here. And then we also saw a contrast that came up that went on into the next part, starting there in verse 7. But we see a great eagle, right? And then what is it contrasted with? Another great eagle. So what does that tell you right there is going on with that contrast?
The great eagle and another great eagle.
Mm-hmm.
They're two of the same type of thing, but they're different.
Okay, two of the same thing, but different.
It says but.
And there's a big but in there, right? Okay, so what is the first eagle in this first section here? The great eagle, he took away this top of this cedar. He planted it, and it became a low-growing vine. When he planted it, how did he go about doing that? What does it tell us? Where did he take it?
In fertile soil.
Okay.
Some seed in the land.
Planted in fertile soil. And what verse was that? 5, right?
5, but in 4,
Mm-hmm.
this is where I got confused. In 4, it says it took the young twigs and brought it to the land of merchants, which would be Babylon.
In a city of traders.
That's what I thought, but I thought we were also talking about the king, so I don't know whether it's Daniel or the king.
Or is it the second that takes the whole land?
Okay, Remember, we're looking just imagery right now. We're not going detail, okay? Because the interpretation literally is given to us in the very next page, okay? So you don't have to get too wrapped around it. What you do know is that then is this eagle came, clipped off the top of this tree, took it to a different location and planted it. But it didn't just plant it any old place. It didn't put it in poverty. It didn't put it in a desert somewhere where there was drought and nothing provided for it, right? It put it in a city of traders. What does that tell you? If you were taken away, if you were kidnapped, but you were taken to a palace and put in, you know, a pretty house and with a beautiful kitchen and full of food, what would you say? Yeah, I'm not happy about being taken away, but my needs are being provided for, right? So this little vine, this top of this tree that becomes a low-growing vine is taken not to a bad place, but to a place where it can thrive, right? So then he says in verse 5 also, he set it beside what?
And he also took
Mm-hmm. He placed it beside. And then he gives us an imagery within an imagery. What did he say there? Like a willow. I love that because what do we know about willow trees? They like to be by water. And their root system goes down and this tree just becomes lush and green. Even in the Psalms, we talk about being placed by trees that are planted by waters, and that their roots will then run really deep and they will be strong and healthy, right? So that tells you a lot, right? And then it sprouted, it became this low-growing vine. So although it was ripped off the top of a tree, it was planted, and once planted, it grew. It began to grow.
I guess I saw that there were, I thought, the top of the young twigs was one thing, and then he said he also took some of the seed of the vine.
Well, that's another little bit of an imagery in there. When it talks about the seed, what does the seed usually mean to you and I? When we talk about a seed that's going to come and a seed that was promised and the seed of the woman and the seed of, what do we know that's talking about? People, right? The reproducing of children and so forth. The seed. And specifically, we're talking about the seed coming Messiah, right? But in this case, it's just saying the seed meaning the people. So it is another, it's almost again a second imagery within an imagery using the subject of seed. In the same way, they use this right here, like a willow. They just threw it in there, right? It's just to expound a little bit more. So to me, this parable, it can be a riddle because he's using imagery within imagery, and he's bringing up a couple of different points and kind of mushing them all together. But you don't get a full understanding it until the riddle is explained. Okay? So, but for right now, even with this much though, it's pretty easy to say, well, whatever he did, yeah, he took away the top of the cedar. Bad eagle, right, in our minds. But that bad eagle took good care of it, took it, planted in fertile soil, put it near a city of traders, placed it beside abundant water. It had all the provisions it needed to be able to grow. Now, the imagery went from being a plant, a tree, a vine, to the idea of people who need water and supplies and a good soil to grow in, right? Okay, so that's the first part of it. That's the imagery. We've already got pretty good understanding at this point, but let's keep moving here.
What is the point? The branches turned toward him, which would be the eagle, but the roots remained under it.
It does not give us interpretation on that except later, kind of. Later we're going to get more insight on that. But just by what you do know, if you know this is Israel, it's talking about Israel being brought into Babylon in captivity, placed by the river Chebar, and allowed to thrive. And what did God told through Jeremiah when he said, you're going to go into this captivity for 70 years, and when you get there, what are you supposed to do? That's right. Don't diminish your number. Grow, thrive, be healthy, continue to grow. Understand that this is my decree to you. This is judgment on you for all that you've done to me, God. And he says, then you're to be there and to thrive. So while they're there, they're not diminishing as a people. Does that fit in any way with the idea of that their roots remained under them? What if he had said their roots did not remain under them? They would die out. They would assimilate into the other nation and not remain their own distinctive people. But instead they went into this captivity. But interestingly, he didn't take them in and throw them among all the Babylonians, although Daniel did. But the majority of them were by the river Chebar. They cleared off a piece of land right near the river by the waters. Because again, back to what we talked about earlier, context, when a kingdom conquers another nation, why are they doing that? What is their desire? To use them. They're a commodity to this nation. And so it's kind of like we talk about, if you've got cattle, you don't beat your cattle. You feed them and you take care of them, you give them their medicine because you want them to produce milk, right? Well, this Nebuchadnezzar, he took these people and put them into his land, but he put them in a place, it says, fertile soil, a city of traders, and placed it beside abundant waters, so that its roots would remain under it. The people, therefore, were somewhat isolated to themselves. They remained their own people group, and they did not begin to assimilate into the rest of the nations, like the Samaritans, who became half-breeds, right?
Simplistically, when I read that, it was like, okay, they got to remain themselves, but they had to give their allegiance and their dependence on somebody else.
Absolutely. And God actually told them, you're to do that. You're to go there and submit to this judgment I am giving you into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? All right, so 7 to 10 then. Now we have another eagle. And and we have this vine. And what do we see the vine doing in relationship to this eagle?
It's now bending toward this other.
Yeah. So the title on this one is then the vine bent toward another eagle. Okay, the vine bent toward another eagle. So this eagle, what did he do for it? All good things, right? I'm going to put a big old smiley face here. He treated it very well, right? And then what did they do? They turned to another eagle to seek for him to give them their water and supply, right? And in that, it said that in verse 8, as a matter of fact, he reiterates this. So let's just put this in here. What does verse 8 reiterate from up here?
Says the same thing.
Okay, tell me.
It was planted in the soil, beside abundant waters. Mighty branches could bear fruit and become a splendid vine.
Okay, and I'm just going to put ... 8, all those things in verse 8. That it might become a splendid vine. I love that. That it might become a splendid Okay, so that was what he wanted for them. He wanted them to become a splendid vine. I can't make that smiley face. I got too big of a smile. Okay. All right, so now let's back up then into verse 7 and see what details it tells us about this vine, because now this is, again, just the imagery part of it. We're going to get the interpretation next. So in verse 7, again, it bent its vine. And its roots also. It says its roots and branches toward another. Okay, what else?
That he sent out branches toward my water.
Yeah. Okay. It bent toward him that, or I could say another eagle to make it clear. That he might water it. All right, and that's in 7 also. Okay, all right, and it was his branches were toward him, rather than toward who? That first great eagle. Okay, and there leaves the reading of the first 10 verses. There's got to be some kind of system here. Okay. We move on then to interpretation, because I love this now. And once you did your word study on that word parable and riddle in particular, and the riddle specifically, where it actually says it requires an interpretation, right? And then when you were moving in this, wasn't it amazing to you when you finally figured it out? It might have taken you a few read-throughs before you finally grab hold of that. But one of the things that would have been a pretty good indicator to you is what was said in verse 12. Did you see that? Do you not know what these things mean? I mean, and so in Daniel, we had the same thing happen. And he said, and this is its interpretation, Daniel would say. So, I mean, that was a little even more clear. But here it's the same thing. One of the things I noticed was there were actually several questions that went on through here. So I marked those with just a little box around them and colored them in a color that would pop on my page. Just the questions, so that I could see where there were imposed thoughts that shows to you that he is trying to give clarification to this parable that was given up front. So the first one's in 12. Do you not know what these things mean? Then
Isn't in 9 the first question?
well, yes, I did mark it, but I'm talking about in the interpretation because we're beyond that. But you could do that.
Who is the he in 9?
Thus says the Lord, will it thrive? Will he not pull up its root? Oh, is the he?
The same eagle?
Okay, which eagle do you think? Well, okay, this is where you're not going to know until you get into the interpretation. Then once you get your interpretation, you go back and go, oh, okay, I know. Now I know who it is that did that. Because the interpretation tells you who's going to do that to them. And then you'll know which of those two eagles it is actually speaking of. Okay? But you're correct, and you're correct, Susan. Verse 9, will it thrive is a question. Thus says the Lord, will it thrive? Will he not pull up its roots and cut off its fruit so that it withers, so that all its sprouting leaves wither? Now, when you think of a vine or a plant, come to my house and look at plants. Withered plants, what's happening to them? They're dying. So you can actually put a tombstone right there on. That's my little sign for anything of death. I put little tombstones, rest in peace, on them. And he says, and neither by great strength nor by many peoples can it be raised from its roots again, because it's dead. You know, and the reason it's going to be dead is because God is going to do something. So the interesting thing in this parable here is he does go from talking about Israel, the nation, then to a specific person of that nation that God's going to have to deal with because of what he did. Okay, and so you're going to see that though once the interpretation is given and once you do your cross-referencing to find it. Right? Okay. So behold. It is planted. Will it thrive? Again, in verse 10. So yes, two questions. I did mark them as you suggested in 9 and then again in 10. And will it thrive? Will it thrive? And the answer is, it's a rhetorical question, right? Will it thrive? No. The answer is a big fat no. Okay, so moreover then starts the beginning of a new thought. Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me saying. So now what we know is now God is giving him another word. So it's a new paragraph because of that. Then in 12, do you not know what these things mean? And so then any other questions as you go along, you might want to mark them also so that they kind of pop out on your page and they help you to see how he's trying to clarify specific points about that first parable, okay? He said, don't you know what these things mean? In 15, will he succeed? Will he who does such things escape? Can he indeed break the covenant and escape? Does that help you at all? We go back to verse 9. Will it thrive? Will he not pull up its root and cut off its fruit so that it withers, so that all its sprouting leaves wither? So who's it speaking about there in verse 9? The he here that is breaking of a covenant, correct? And who is it that's going to deal with him? So you have to decide which of those two eagles it is that deals with that person who broke covenant. What is your first question then about the covenant part of it? Who did he make the covenant with? What are the two parties that make covenant? Who of those two eagles would be concerned about that covenant being broken? The one who made the covenant with, right? So it seems to me like a logical process of thinking to say, well, the one whom you broke the covenant with is the one who would be very upset. And he's the one who's going to want to take your head off. And apparently it says, will he thrive? And the answer is no, it's not going to thrive. Okay, so that we're jumping ahead a little bit to come to some of those thoughts, but you've done all the groundwork on this, so it really helps if we can just kind of talk it through as these thoughts come. I think it works fine for me. Okay, so now we're ready for interpretation. We're going to look at 11 to 21 in one big heap. In there, we said already, the major subject there is covenant, right? And we've identified now a couple of people in here. We've got who? Where's my marker? It's over here. We've got the king of Babylon and one of the royal family, and I think it was 17, Pharaoh. So we've got three people, places, and events when you're looking at history, and these are the three key players in the subject matter here. So when it comes to the bigger picture on this, though, who are the two people involved in the conflict? A third party gets brought in, but who's the real conflict that's going on in here?
One of the royal family and
Yeah. And the king of Babylon. So king of Babylon, who represents which of these eagles? The first one that plucked him up and put him by the river Chebar in Babylon. Okay, so we know then that it's about the king of Babylon, and what did he do to her? Interpretation on this? He says in verse 12, so say now there's a word for the word the prophet is speaking. Again, I've got my little horn that says this is the prophet speaking. Say now to the rebellious house, do you not know what these things mean? Say, again, the prophet's symbol, say, behold, the king of Babylon came to Jerusalem, took its king and princesses, and brought them to him where? In Babylon. So now you know the people, the places, and the events. There's three of them right there in one sentence, right? So how did you title this then? The king of Babylon did what? It's a long title again, but you know, he took Israel. To Babylon. And made a covenant with who? It's very vague. One of the, with the royal line. And what that means is it's with another person of leadership, the kingship there, right? That's and that's of Israel, correct? So you might want to give yourself a couple of little symbols to help you figure what's going on. So it's the king of Babylon. He took Israel to Babylon, and he made a covenant with the royal line. And that's all we have right there. Now we need to explain what that's talking about, because how can he take them captive and yet still make a covenant with them? Well, it kind of explains it, though, right there in the details, right? So what did happen? Yep, now we want some history.
So they had the first king who also got in trouble, and when Nebuchadnezzar was coming back, he died. That's why Jehoiachin gets taken, had been on the throne for like 3 months.
Yes. Okay, so Babylon, interesting, it says, came to Lebanon, which is really interesting. We're going to talk about that in a second. And he took its king and princesses to Babylon, correct? Nebuchadnezzar took kings and princesses to Babylon. All right, that's in verse 12. And so, as Kristen was saying, then that takes you into some cross-referencing, right? So, we have, just as I have a whole bunch of things here I can give you, but Jehoiakim, the king took him captive in the 8th year of his reign. He had been on the throne in Israel for 8 years when he was taken captive. You find this in 2 Kings 24:12. If you want to put a cross-reference next to your that part right there where it says him taking, I have no room on my page to write another thing. He took one of the royal family, made a covenant with him. But the first one, he came to Babylon in verse 12, took its king and princesses and brought them to Babylon. Your cross-reference is 2 Kings 24:12. And then where does that correlate then with for us? Where did we begin our book? Go back to chapter 1 and look in verses 1 and 2. Now we're in the 5th year at the time of that writing. But what we see by looking back in Ezekiel chapter 1 is, where is Jehoiakim? Right there in Babylon, right as it says. It tells you in 2 Kings he was taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar and taken to Babylon. And we opened up the book of Ezekiel seeing him in Babylon in the 5th year of his captivity. Okay? So that's two cross references. Ezekiel 1 and 2 gives you that connects those 2 points together. Now we're looking at the second verse in 13. He says, now he took one of the royal family and made covenant with him, putting him under oath. And he also took away the mighty of the land, that the kingdom might be in subjection. Do you see that it might be? So you see that kind of like as a reason behind this is the purpose of what he's doing, that it might be in subjection, not exalting itself, but what? Keeping his covenant. And then there's a that. This is real important. Highlight it, mark it big. Okay? That what? That it might continue. And who's the it? Jerusalem. Yes, Israel. At least what's left of it is Jerusalem in particular, proper, right? We're talking about that city. That's the last part of the siege that hadn't yet taken place. So the initial covenant then was made by Babylon with this king. So when you go into 2 Kings 24, you find out that king and what his name is, which is? Zedekiah, okay? So 2 Kings 24:2 says, then the king of Babylon, it goes on, actually, it's through all of these. I have 2 Kings 24, I have 17 to 20. Then I have it again in 2 Chronicles 36, 11 to 16. You know what? I could probably just send you guys these. I've got them all ready together. It'd probably be easiest. There's 5 pages of these things I'm going to be given to you. But here it says, then the king of Babylon made meaning Jehoiakim, who's now in captivity, made his uncle Matthiah king in his place, and he changed his name to Zedekiah. Okay? So the king that's now by the river Chebar with Ezekiel, his uncle was taken, made a vassal king by Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar says, if you'll keep this covenant, you're going to be safe. Right? All right. So he said Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king. He reigned 11 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Hamudal, whatever. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that Jehoiakim had done. So Jehoiakim's father had done evil. Jehoiachin went into captivity because of all the stuff that was going on around him. Sounds like he was kind of the innocent victim in this. And now Zedekiah was taken and put in the place of him to rule. So that's how this picture lays out. You've got a vassal king in there. Even though the kings had been taken, so the top of that cedar had been taken. Its rulers, its major people that had been in place as an independent nation was clipped off and taken and put into captivity. Now a vassal king who would be subject to Babylon was put in place to be under the king. But they don't destroy the city because it's a piece of property for them. It's a resource. They're going to use the people there and the land and the things that they grow. They want to have those things. In 2 Chronicles 36, it says this. This is in 11 to 16. Ezekiel was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, so it said twice about him, about Zedekiah. He's not a good guy. He did not humble himself before Jeremiah the prophet, who was right there in Jerusalem with him, telling him, thus saith the Lord, you're going to go into captivity. Don't resist, just go. But he wouldn't listen. He also rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. Now, does that sound familiar? He rebels. He got captured by Nebuchadnezzar. He was put under covenant with him. But then what did he do? He bent his branches towards another eagle, right? So he rebelled against him. The one whom he had sworn allegiance by God. That's the problem. When you stand before God. Okay, let's go into present day on some of this for some practical application. You go into a covenant, and the most common one is marriage. So we'll talk on marriage, but there are other kinds of covenants. You can go into a business covenant with someone as well. If you go into a covenant with someone under duress, under pressure, in this case, he didn't really want to do any of this. He was just yanked out of the royal line and said, you will be the king and you will submit to me, King Nebuchadnezzar. Well, he makes this covenant, though, with him, and he stands there and he swears an oath before God. Is he accountable? Absolutely. If you go into a marriage, even though you may have thought it was right at the moment, but it turns out to be wrong later, but yet what have you done at the wedding altar? You swore an allegiance before God. The two shall become one. So who's accountable in that? You are. Even if you are a victim in some way later, you are still responsible for the covenant. Now, I don't want to get into details on the what ifs and all the weird stuff that you can get into a real tangled mess in this. But the principle, the doctrine in this is covenant is binding. And regardless of circumstances, you're bound to that covenant. Now, God in marriage, he gives all kinds of ways to, in grace, allow for sin of man and allow people to get out if they need to. So I'm not saying I'm not for all that, but I'm saying in principle, it's binding. So there are some basic principles about covenant that I put all together again that just helps to show the idea here. One of them is in Jeremiah 34, where he talks about the idea of this covenant that has been made. He said, 34, 15 to 18, you recently repented and did what was right in my eyes by proclaiming liberty each to his neighbor. Now, this is Jeremiah talking to the people back in Jerusalem still. You made a covenant before me, God, in the house that is called by my name, but then you turned around and profaned my name. When each of you took back his male and female slaves, whom you had set free according to their desire, and you brought them into subjection to be your slaves again. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, you have not obeyed me by proclaiming liberty, every one to his brother and to his neighbor. Behold, I proclaim to you liberty, to the sword, to pestilence, to famine, declares the Lord. I will make you a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. And the men who transgressed my covenant, again, see, my covenant, you made a covenant, you made a promise, you made a vow publicly in the assembly of the people, I'm going to let these people go. Well, when you make a vow, regardless of what kind of vow you're talking about, if it's done before the Lord, it is a vow that you are held to. And here he goes on to say, the men who transgressed my covenant and did not keep the terms of the covenant that they made before me, I will make them like the calf that they cut in two and passed between its parts. Do you know what they do when they make covenant, right? They take the animals, they cut them in half. They usually have a little trench. Half of the animals lay here, the other half lay here. We see this in Genesis 15 when God cuts covenant with Abraham. And then in that picture, God is the one making the covenant, so he passed through the pieces of the flesh. But when men are making covenants with one another, they walk between the pieces. They generally walk in a figure 8. The idea is it's an eternally binding thing. It's forever. It's an eternal thing. So symbolically, they make that figure 8, which has no end. And when they do that, the blood then splashes upon their feet and upon the hems of their garment. And that is a picture that if you ever break that covenant, what has happened to these animals that you're standing between, well, it can happen to you. Your life is on the line if you break covenant. It can be on the line. Now, aren't we glad that we live in grace and that God doesn't always do that to us? Many of us have when it comes to marriage and divorce, there's a lot of people I know who have gone through that, and people who are sorry that they had to go through that. In my own family, we've seen it. But God is gracious and God does forgive, but the principle still stands, that it's binding, and it means that if you do this, if you break that covenant, and it's of your doing, not someone else doing it to you, but of your doing, then it is possible this could be what we call a sin unto death. And I want to say that is what we're looking at here. That is why back there in that previous part of the verse, he says in verse 9, thus says the Lord God, will it thrive? Will he not pull up its roots and cut off its fruit so that it withers, so that all its sprouting leaves wither? And neither by great strength nor by many peoples can it be raised from its roots again? Why not? Because it's going to be dead. Because God is going to take Zedekiah's life for breaking the covenant that he made, swearing an oath to God, to this foreign dignitary. And I can't help but bring out the point that part of this has to do with what Ezekiel eventually is going to get into, where it says, and Israel profaned my holy name before the nations. So here's Israel, who's supposed to be a people, a covenant people. That's the whole title of who they are as a people. They're the covenant people. They understand what covenant is about and the seriousness of it. They make a covenant in the name of their God with a foreign nation. I will submit to you, said Zedekiah, and then he didn't. So it is no wonder that God says, like those animals that you walked between, I will make you. That is what is going on here in this particular reference. Okay, now let's look to the next part of this. Oh, I've got so many things here to cover. Okay, we're good. I think we're good. Nebuchadnezzar took kings and princes to Babylon. What else do we see going on in 11 to 21? Let's talk about Lebanon real quick. It said Lebanon in verse 3. What do we know the interpretation is now that we're here in verse 12? That is Jerusalem. It's a simile used for Jerusalem. Why might that be? Does anybody know anything about their temple? When Solomon built the temple, what did he do? He made it with the cedars of Lebanon. And it said in my commentary that, let's see if I can find it, well, I don't know where it's at, but anyway, it said in my commentaries that the Jews of that day referred to that as the cedars, as the temple, as the place of Lebanon, because of the beautiful woodwork that was put in there. And when you go back into the history on that, Solomon went to the king of Tyre, which is along those forestry areas where these big cedars of Lebanon grew, and they were so famous and so beautiful. The wood was so beautiful that he procured, and he made a covenant with a king of a foreign nation. Now, ding, ding, ding. Is Israel supposed to do that? No. But he did. And for whatever reason, the Lord allowed it. And what we're seeing here then is the Lord is showing us here, this place began to be called, by many people of that day, the place of Lebanon, or the city of Lebanon, because of the cedar work that was in the temple work. There was so much of it, and it was beautiful. But we have the interpretation given to us in 12, because it says the king of Babylon came to Jerusalem, where in 3 it says the eagle, he came to Lebanon and took away the top of the cedar. Well, in 12 he says he came to Jerusalem and took away the kings and the princesses. So you see the the translation right there. So interpretation is made very clear. It's not a mystery. Okay, so 3 is interpreted in verse 12. All right, now the next part, he put the royal, I'm just going to put it that way, the royal, meaning Zedekiah, under covenant. And he did that for 2 reasons. Because of through the covenant, that covenant that he made with him was made to make him what, according to verse 14? To be subject to him, and to not do what? Not to exalt itself. Okay? When you go back to the imagery of the first parable, what happened in that when that second eagle is mentioned? What did the vine do? Roots and his branches toward that second eagle. So what would you call that? Would you call that being in subjection to Nebuchadnezzar, the first eagle? Would you call that not exalting himself? No. He was trying to get out from underneath King of Babylon. He thought he could call on Egypt to be a friend, and that this friend would come and rescue him from this. And that was not what was going to happen. All right, so he put him under covenant. Number 1, not to be subject to him. And number 2, not to exalt himself. Okay, so don't resist, don't put up a fuss, just do that. So this is going to be looked at, if you want to, in Jeremiah 37. He did it, he put him under oath. I'm going to put covenant on here, because an oath is a covenant, right? He put him under covenant. And he did that, so that is in there. So that what? In verse, I think it's 14.
That might not be a subjection.
That it might continue. That it might continue. And I'm going to translate that so that Jerusalem might continue. This is interesting because I've never realized that this was part of this process. Remember we talked about how God does things progressively, incrementally, and he has done this before in the New Testament. Some are weak, some are sick, and some have fallen asleep. Well, with Jerusalem, it was first siege, second siege, third siege. And along the way, what is God trying to get you to do? He doesn't want you to go all the way to the end and get axed, right? He's hoping that you will do what? Repent and turn back. And when you go into Jeremiah and do a lot of reading there, it says it over and over. Ezekiel has even said it. Don't be rebellious. Turn your hearts to me. Repent. Turn back to me. Obey me. But they won't listen. And so here we see then that in this moment here in this recording that we're looking at, this is before Jerusalem has its third siege and is finally completely cut off. God had given him favor with the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar came in, made this covenant with Zedekiah, and he said to him, if you will be subject to me, and if you will not exalt yourself against me, Jerusalem will remain. I never knew that. I always thought it was just in the eyes of God, it always was a done deal, because God knew where this was going to go. But Zedekiah had a chance to keep Israel alive. And had he done that, God would have not had to leave his temple, would not had to have left his city. I mean, although I think the people had already sinned so badly that, it was almost an inevitable thing unless they repented. But see, they weren't repenting. They still had opportunity. What does that tell you about our God? How patient he is. It does not matter how far down the road you guys are, in any sin you're in, you can stop and turn around and God will forgive. He will forgive, always. But you have to be the one to bow your knee to him. He is the righteous standard. He is the one who is holy, and he is the one to whom you must turn. And if you are not willing to do that, then your rewards are just rewards, right? And that is what's happening here with Jerusalem. So now Zedekiah did not do Jerusalem any big favors. And then he goes on to say then about this secondary person. I'm going to write it in a different color because we're bringing in that second eagle here. What does he say about Pharaoh in 17? Yep, Pharaoh will not help you. What had he done over here? He had bent his vine, right, toward this other eagle. But he's telling him here, no, Pharaoh will not help. And it goes on, in time of war, right? And that's speaking of what in verse 17? What is Babylon going to do? Yeah. When Babylon casts up ramps and a siege wall. Where have we heard about the ramp and the siege walls before? Yes. Lay on this side, lay on this side. Take a brick, write Jerusalem, build a wall around it. So he has already done this through imagery. What do we call it? Charades, right? And so this is like a reiterating of that. And here he's saying, Pharaoh's not going to help when Babylon does this to you. When they cast up the walls and they siege you. Okay, I made a mess of that one, didn't I? Oh, yeah. When they cast ramps and they siege. And there's more details than that, but at least that's the basics, right? So now there are several verses here on this particular subject. I'm just going to rattle them off so you can go in and look at them. Jeremiah 37, basically 7 to 10, but all of 37 is good. One verse in Jeremiah 40:30, and then another small passage in Jeremiah 52, 4 to 16 that will help give you a little more clarity about that sieging of Jerusalem and all that took place there, okay?
You're going to send us that, though.
I'm going to send you all these references. It'll help you. Yeah, I'll make sure you get all my notes. I did a lot of extra homework because it wasn't in the homework. And it could be that Kay is going to give it to us later because we're not there yet. We're going to keep going until he finally makes a switch and begins to judge the other nations. And we're going to see that eventually. But there is so much more yet, and maybe she's just not dumping it all in 1 week. The fact that we slowed down and just did one chapter of homework, though, gave me plenty of time to go in and do all these cross-references and find them. And by the way I do that sometimes, I just open up my search engine on my computer and type in the question, when did Jerusalem fall in its third siege? And then boom, I get lots of opportunities. Now, be careful what you go into. I went into one this morning that took me into a group. They're not Christian at all. Now they're stuck on my phone. I opened it up before I realized who it was. Once I found out who it was, I went, and now I'm trying, how do I delete that? It's going to keep showing up on my feed now. But anyway, be careful that you make sure you get a good resource. Okay, so Pharaoh's not going to help you when that happens. Now, let me look here. Okay, that was in Jeremiah 37, I gave you that. Verses 1 to 10 actually is what I have on here. And then this one here I'll just read. Jeremiah 44:30, thus says the Lord, behold, I am going to give over Pharaoh to the hand of his enemies, to the hand of those who seek his life, just as I gave Zedekiah, king of Judah, to the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, who was his enemy and was seeking his life. Now, why would God do that? Why would God all of a sudden just turn on Egypt?
Egypt was involved in breaking God's covenant.
Right. Now, it isn't so much that they were involved in the breaking of the covenant, but they were involved in possibly coming to help them, right? Do you remember what God did when he brought Israel out of Egyptian captivity. He sent all the plagues. And he did all these things to try to turn the people and to turn their hearts. So what we see is we have a God that's sovereign. He can orchestrate so that things will come out the way he wants them to come out. God's design from the beginning was, through the prophet, you will go into Babylon for 70 years. So is anything going to stop that? No. So in this one little verse, what we see here is God's turning the enemies of Egypt, who are already their enemies anyway, but he's stirring up their hearts somehow so that they come against Egypt, so that Egypt will be thwarted in coming to help Babylon. I thought that was interesting. And there's other points to it too. That's just one point. Jeremiah 52 says, he and all his army against Jerusalem camped against it and built a siege wall. That was Nebuchadnezzar. The army of the Chaldeans pursued the king and overtook Zedekiah. Then what happened to Zedekiah? Because we want to kind of wrap this up and move into the next part of this. Pharaoh's not going to come to help Babylon in this. He wants them to. He turns toward them. He sends envoys to go and get them to come help. What did you find out? Anything? What happened when they went to Egypt to get help?
Well, they came part way and then turned around because Nebuchadnezzar's like, get out of here. And they're like, bye.
Yep. Once they got there and realized what they were up against, this mighty nation called Babylon at that time was a world power. It's kind of like what America used to be when we stood up and said, watch it, and they hightailed it out, right? Not so much right now, but that is the way it has always been. And so this is what happened. Nebuchadnezzar said, don't interfere. I'm here. And this was all God's design, that God was taking them into Babylon. And why was God taking them into Babylon rather than into Egypt? He took them out of Egypt once, and he said, never go back there again, right? And when he took them to Babylon, what did Nebuchadnezzar do for them? Yeah, they were planted in it, and they began to grow. He put them there so that they might survive. His desire was that they not lose their identity as a people, and that while they're in their captivity for punishment, time out. You're on time out for 70 years. You didn't obey me. So as a good parent would do, put them in time out, but you want to destroy your child. You want them to learn their lesson. And so that's what God was doing. He sent them there. So what did King of Babylon then do to Zedekiah? Anybody look that up?
Is that where we studied?
Yeah, where when he tries to escape, he catches him and he kills his sons in front of him and then blinds him.
Right.
The thing he never saw was the murder of his kids,
And then
taken into Babylon and he dies.
and he goes to Babylon and he dies in Babylon. So that's the story. That's the interpretation. So if you want your interpretation to that last part there, verse 9, you could put right next to it Jeremiah 52, 4-11. The army of the Chaldeans pursued the king and overtook Zedekiah. He slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. He blinded Zedekiah, bound him, and then brought him to Babylon and put him into prison until the day of his death. So that's interpretation for verse 9 and 10, right? Will he thrive? Will he survive? No. And then did you notice it says as soon as the east wind strikes it. Now what's the east wind? Babylon. And it's east of what? East of Jerusalem. Everything is central. Anytime the Bible talks north, south, east, west, put Israel right in the middle of it and do all of your figuring in your head, north, south, east, and west of Jerusalem. So to the east of Israel is Babylon. So that's who it's speaking of there. The east is speaking of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay. All right, now let's go on to the next part, because this one's really cool, because now we enter into basically a secondary prophecy. It's tacked on to the end of this, because, by the way, if you were just left right there as people in captivity, remember, these are the elders of the people who are by the river Chebar with Ezekiel. They've come to his house to seek his instructions, supposedly to hear from the Lord, and God says, speak to the hand, right? All right, so that's still the scenario that we're looking at. These people are before him asking, when you get to this place where God says, forget it, Pharaoh's not going to help you. You've broken this covenant, and I've already told you that you're going to be destroyed. And we probably should put that on there as a total, as a grand. He says in verse 9, give me the essence of it so I can write a title over here for this. Will it thrive is a good point. Will it, meaning Jerusalem, Jerusalem's king, I'm going to put that specifically because it's talking about Nebuchadnezzar there. Will he thrive? And if he's not going to thrive, then Jerusalem's also not going to thrive. That's why it uses the word it, because when the king is affected, the whole city is affected, and they get the ramifications of what their king has done. So will it, Jerusalem and its king, will it thrive? And the answer is no. And what does it say is the end of it? It will wither. It will wither. Okay, so now back to I'm going to do a tombstone here with my grass. Okay, rest in peace. It's not going to survive. It's going to die. Okay, so you're by the river Chebar, and Ezekiel has just told you this. Is that where you want to be left? So what does God do next? He gives them some hope. Isn't that awesome? So now he gives a long-term prophecy that he tacks on to the end of this. But he uses some of the same imagery that he's already had procured at the beginning of this, the idea of that cedar, right? So he speaks of another one. He says, thus says the Lord, I will also take a sprig from the lofty top of the cedar. So what cedar is he talking about? Who's the cedar? Israel. He said, I'll take the lofty top of that cedar and I will set it out. Did anybody do a word study on set it out? Set it out means to consecrate it, devote it, commit it, or appoint it. Okay, that's really cool. And lofty simply means high and exalted. It's above it's the cream of the crop. It's the most excellent, right? So he's going to take that particular sprig from a lofty top of the cedar and set it out. I will pluck from the topmost of the young twigs a tender one, and I will plant it on a high and lofty mountain. Oh, is this ever beautiful? This is so cool. Now, you're not going to get the fullness of this until you understand what that twig is talking about. So I have, this is page 3 and 4. 3 and 4, 1. I'm looking for my other pages. Hold on. Maybe I can get it from this one. This is probably better. I'll go from here. Okay. You have to see what that lofty twig is. The twig is number 3127. That word is a branch. Does it make a little bit better sense at this point? If you have the idea of a branch. I'm going to take a branch. I'm going to pluck that branch. I'm going to pull it. I'm going to receive it. I'm going to acquire it from the topmost of the young twigs, of the other branches, of a tender one. I will plant it on a high and lofty mountain. On the high mountain of Israel, I will plant it, that it may bring forth boughs and bear fruit, and become a stately cedar. Now that stately, again, is talking about excellence, royalty. So it takes you right into the interpretation of royalty. Now, I forgot to find my word studies on that one. Hold on. Because I know I have so much going here, you guys. Hold on. Great, eagle, high, top. Stately. Here it is. Okay, stately. It's number 117 in the Strong's, and then I went on into the Dictionary of Biblical Languages as well. But it means great and majestic, great one, majestic one. And then in the Dictionary of Biblical Languages, it says beautiful and splendid, pertaining to that which has a lofty, desirable appearance. And it actually gives Ezekiel 17 right there as its reference. So it's talking about this desirable appearance pertaining to being lovely. Now, so when you hear about that subject matter of the branch, he says, when I do that, when it becomes a stately branch, what's going to happen? The birds of every kind will do what? Nest under it, and they will nest in the shade of its branches. What is that talking about? Well, when you did the Daniel chapter 4, I think it was, right, where he's the tree there. When he is described in Daniel chapter 4, it talks about, have I not exalted you? Have I not made you this great and mighty tree? Do the birds of the sky not come and nest in you? Do not the animals find their shade underneath you? So he gives that same imagery of, at that time, Nebuchadnezzar being the stately cedar tree, and him providing shelter and shade and sustenance to all the peoples around it, of all the nations, because he became a world global power. Well, here we have another one. It's a different one. It's not Nebuchadnezzar. It's going to be plucked off that same cedar that we see here that becomes the vine. And who is that cedar? Israel. I'm looking for it here. Jerusalem, right? That cedar that was plucked off in verse 3, in 12, it's told to us is Jerusalem. So again, now we're back to the line of David, to the house of David, to the royal line of David, the priestly line, and he's going to pluck a branch from the very top of it, and that branch is going to become something even greater than they've ever seen. So he went from saying, I'm going to destroy you, and you're going to be wiped out, and you are going to go into your captivity, to then saying to them, but, says the Lord, I also will do this thing. I'm going to do that to you, but I will also do this other thing. And then he says, on this high mountain of Israel, I will plant it. And you could put he right there and put a nice little pretty red cross on that, because who is that branch that God is going to do this with? This is speaking of Jesus. This is a prophecy of Israel's future and their restoration to a stately cedar with the Messiah as its king. Isn't this exciting? I love this. And when we get into the other passages that are coming up yet ahead, we will see where God talks about making a new covenant with Israel. And in that day, this is how it's going to all unfold. So this is a long-reaching prophecy here, where these other prophecies are short-term. We're getting very close, within just a few years at this point, of Jerusalem being wiped out and being brought fully into its captivity. But in the prophecy, he's speaking about at another time. I will also. So I want to put that on here. He says, I will also. Okay? That's huge, because that says, I'm not going to leave you there. I'm going to tell you that there's something more I'm going to do. And he says about that branch, what does he say about the branch? From the cedar branch? Where does it come from? It's lofty, top of the cedar. Lofty, top of the cedar. And what is he going to do? Going to plant it on a high, and does it say lofty again?
Yeah.
Good. I like that. Lofty mountain. And then what's it going to do?
It will bring forth,
It will bring forth what?
is it bows?
Uh-huh.
Bear fruit.
Will bring forth and bear fruit. It will, okay, and anything else?
Become a stately cedar.
It will become a stately cedar. I just love this whole thing. Okay, so here's a high mountain. He's going to make another tree, right? And it's a big one. And he says, I'm going to take from its top and do all this that I'm saying here. So you have Jesus then being prophesied. This is a prophecy of Jesus, who is going to be planted on a high holy hill, a high holy mountain. Now, when we get to the end of Ezekiel, what do we know is going on at the end of Ezekiel? The millennial kingdom. And he speaks of that here then. He's saying they will rest in the shade of its branches. This is speaking of then, I love my drawings because they help me so much. okay? And he's saying he's going to be, and this is my flag over the kingdom, God's kingdom. This is going to be the coming kingdom of Christ. This is speaking of a millennial reign that he is going to produce. He said, that's the prophecy he leaves us with at the end of this. I will take the sprig of the lofty cedar top, and it becomes a stately cedar. So then you can go into all these cross references. Oh, we've still got a few minutes. We're good. Is that right?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Oh, good.
Like
Oh,
20 minutes.
oh my gosh.
Is your title I will also? Is that what your title is?
Oh, no. My title, no, I actually gave it a long one. I will plant it and do all this stuff. I will also, you could do that. I will also plant a stately cedar. How about that? That's a good title because that shortens it. So I'm going to do this. I will take him. Is he going to thrive? No, it will wither. But now he says, but I will also plant a stately cedar, and it's going to be one that is going to do all these things. And he doesn't talk about eternity in here or any of those things, but we know that's what he's saying. He says, by the way, he goes in 24, all the trees of the field will know that I am the Lord. Who are all the other trees of the field? All the other nations are going to know that I am the Lord. I bring down the high tree and exalt the low tree. I dry up the green tree and I make the dry tree flourish. What does that also sound like? Remember what Daniel, he says, I raise up kings and I put them down, right? He is sovereign. He was God most high, and he is the one that will do this. Let me see if I've got, well, let me do the branches first. Okay, because I want to give you some branches verses, because this is what it's talking about, this twig. Or they call it a sprig, and they added that word in there because it's not even in the original. As I will take from the lofty top of the cedar and set it out. I will pluck from the topmost of its young twigs. Now that word twig is the word branch. And a tender one, a tender what? A tender twig. And I will plant it on a high and lofty mountain. So when you look at that word branch, then you can go into Jeremiah 23:5. And he says this, you're going to love it. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he will reign as king and act wisely and do justice and righteousness in the land. And then Isaiah 4:2, and in that day the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious. So what did we say? He was going to be splendid and stately, right? And the fruit of the earth will be the pride of the adornment of the survivors of Israel. So we talked about that in the last parable, where we talked about how there are going to be other nations that are going to survive, and they are going to be given to her as daughters, to be a joy and a delight to Israel. Other nations will be entering into the millennial kingdom, and they are going to be given to her to be as daughters to her. So same thing, Isaiah 4:2. Then Isaiah 11, you're going to know this one, Isaiah 11, 1-5. Then a shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse, and a branch from its roots. Again, same imagery. And it will bear fruit, boughs, right, and bear fruit. Here's the great. The Spirit of the Lord will rest upon him. Him what? Him, the branch. The spirit of wisdom and understanding, the spirit of counsel and strength. Are you guys beginning to recognize this? A spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what his eye sees, nor make a decision by what his ears hear. He's going to know because he is the Lord. This is a prophetic picture of Jesus right there as the mighty God, the counselor. Jeremiah 33:15-16 says, in those days and at that time, I will cause a righteous branch of David to spring forth. He will execute justice and righteousness on the earth in those days. Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will dwell in safety. And this is the name by which she shall be called. The Lord is our righteousness. I'm like, I'm getting so excited. I just love one. Zechariah, now listen, Joshua, the high priest, you and your friends who are sitting in front of you. Indeed, they are men who are a symbol, for behold, I am going to bring my servant, the branch. So there's that beautiful picture. Zechariah 6:12 and 13. Then say to them, thus says the Lord of hosts, behold, a man whose name is Branch. For he will branch out from where he is, and he will build the temple of the Lord. Yes, it is he who will build the temple of the Lord, and he who will bear the honor and sit and rule on its throne. He will be a priest on his throne, and the council of peace will be between the two offices. So he's going to be both priest and, what was the other one? Priest and counselor. Okay, so those are the verses I found on the subject of branch, just a few of them. There's probably a ton more, but that got me started. And I thought that explains what's being talked about here. The branch is Jesus, who God is so he gives a prophecy at the end of doom and gloom for Israel in that moment before they go into their Babylonian captivity. But he closes it with a word of hope. I will also plant a stately cedar. So there's hope and revival that's giving to them there. I love that. Let's see, is there anything else I needed to cover before we wrap that up? We do need titles, right? Right. Okay, so we got the title for Two Eagles and a Vine. We need to finish that title up. Now that we've done the rest and we see that it's about Zedekiah breaking covenant with Babylon, and in that he defames God's holy name, and therefore God holds him accountable. You made a covenant, you defiled it. Will you thrive? Are you going to survive this? No. Why? Because in covenant, you've walked between the pieces of flesh. You made a covenant in my name, and I will hold you accountable. Okay, so we need to title.
So I know that this last part doesn't use the word covenant. And isn't this the Abrahamic covenant?
Fulfilled. Yeah, it's part of the yes. As a matter of fact, but I was listening to a really good preacher just this morning. Well, I wouldn't say it was really good, but he made one good point that I really liked. And that was that he was saying how all the covenants in Scripture, in one fashion or another, are fulfilled in the new covenant in Jesus Christ. And when God makes that culmination in what he has promised through Jesus, that is the coming millennial kingdom and the kingdom to come, all that brings to fruition or brings to fulfillment all the things starting with the Eden covenant with Adam and Eve, all the way through, all of them in some form or fashion get fulfilled. I thought that was really a good point. Okay, so we need a title. I'm going to use a red marker, I think, to get this title up here so it's different. I'm going to talk about Zedekiah because that's who it's about. And what did he do? He broke covenant. And then what? And what's God going to do to him because of it? Yeah, he actually says, and he will inflict it upon his head. In verse 19, therefore thus says the Lord God, as I live, surely my oath which Zedekiah, he despised, and my covenant which Zedekiah broke, I will inflict on his head. So that's what we see in the interpretation is Zedekiah broke covenant, and God will inflict it, meaning the broken covenant, on his head. And there's a tombstone. Right? He's telling him, I'm going to hold him accountable for what he has done.
I put covenant broken and then covenant kept because I
Well,
this last part was so significant.
Yeah, the prophecy at the end, yes. But if you're trying to get an interpretation of the two eagles and a vine, it's this. You almost could title this separately. So it's kind of hard. But in a way, it was kind of tacked on as a word of hope. It wasn't really, the major part of the subject matter was the parable and its interpretation through verse 21. This was tacked on, I think, to help give them hope at the end. This was 22, is it 24? Yeah, okay. Okay, 22. So this is the prophecy in 22 to 24. And at first you don't catch it because it's back to talking about cedars again, and you're like, okay, are we still talking about the first one, last one? But when I started doing my word studies, when I got that word twig figured out that it meant branch, and then I started evaluating what was going to happen in it, it all came together. So lofty, the branch helped me a lot. It will be a stately cedar, a noble one, a great majestic one. And then it says, and all the trees will know that I am the Lord. Now, I have a whole list of things. I'm not going to take the time to go through them, where he shows a contrast, again, another contrast in this section. Let's write it up here, because we did a couple over here. I think I'll do a different color, though, so they stand out over here. We see, I will bring down the high tree, and then I will do what in verse 20? And I will, but what does he do to the low tree? Is it in 24?
Exalt the low tree.
Yeah, exalt the low tree. So that's in verse 24. I will bring down the high tree, and I will exalt the low tree. Now, what is that talking about? What is the imagery then of a high tree that needs to be brought down? What's the problem with the high tree? Prideful, and not submitting to God, and not being obedient to God. So this is the arrogant, the lofty, the prideful. God is going to bring the prideful down, and what is he going to do with the lowly? So who's the lowly? This almost makes me think about the Sermon on the Mount. Yeah? And so the ones who are humble, God is going to exalt. You could get cross references on that one. It would be good. And he says about, I will dry up. These are the I wills in here. I will dry up the high tree. Again, same imagery. Huh? Oh, green tree. Sorry. Green tree. And I will make the dry tree Okay, again, same thing, same imagery. The one that is exalted, the one, I will dry up the green tree, the tree that says I have nothing, I have need of nothing, I have it all. That's Revelation with the letters to the churches, right? I have it all, I don't need anything. He says, buy from me, right? Salve for your eyes and all those things. Okay, God will set up his kingdom. Jesus will be King of Kings and will rule over all. And I've listed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like 6 different, several in Daniel, but then 6 other passages that talk about God setting up his kingdom. I took you into Daniel where it talks about the toes of the statue, and those toes become the end time kingdom, and how he works through on that. But then I ended up taking you into Revelation 19. So let's close with reading that, because that's such a beautiful. Who can read that nice and loud so that they can hear it on the thing? Oh, you want me to look it up, huh?
No, like, well, you said we don't have mics.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, let me read it. So it's Revelation 19:11. Okay, 19:11 here. This closes it out, because this is speaking about the promise, I will also plant a stately tree, and it's going to be on a high and lofty mountain, and it will bring forth, and it will bear fruit, and it will become a stately cedar. I'm going to bring down the high and the exalted ones. I'm going to dry up the green ones, the ones who think they've got everything and they don't have need of nothing, and I will make the dry tree flourish. So knowing then that that's speaking about the coming millennial kingdom, When does this all happen? Well, this is the moment right here when we see it beginning, as Jesus returns on his beautiful horse. He says in verse 11 of Revelation, "And I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat upon it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and wages war. And his eyes are like a flame of fire, and upon his head are many diadems. And he has a name written upon him which no one knows except himself. He is clothed with a robe dipped in blood." Now there's the blood of the covenant. He walked between the pieces for us on our behalf, so his robe is dipped in blood. And his name is called the Word of God. Sorry. "And the armies which are in heaven, clothed in fine linen, white and clean, are following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword, so that with it he may smite the nations. And he will rule them with a rod of iron. And he treads," I'm sorry, I'm choking. "And he treads the winepress of the fierce wrath of God, the Almighty. And on his robe and on his thigh he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords." I love that. I wish I'd done a better job of reading it. Sorry, I got choked. All right. Well, we did it. I think we got through another parable, another mystery, another riddle. And you're ready for your holidays now. I pray your blessings upon all of you and your families. And enjoy the downtime. And when you can, take the time to get in and do a little bit of review. When we come back, I'll do a whole review for you that very first week, just to get you fresh, so that you can go back in and start on the next part. Okay, January 8th, we will be back for picking up where we left off here in Ezekiel.